Okay, I guess we can get started. My name is Bob Bixby. I'm the Executive Director of the Concord Coalition. I want to welcome everybody here this morning. Thank our hosts at CED. Thank Joe for staying up all night and doing all that baking and partake of the wonderful products out there. At the Concord Coalition, we have been advocating fiscal responsibility for quite some time, and one of our favorite people to work with on the Hill has been Senator Kent Conrad. He has, throughout his career, been one of the premier, not the premier, deficit hawk on the Hill. And like Conrad, the Concord Coalition and CED earlier this year have been looking at the trends. We're not content to just worry about domestic challenges to our budget. We've been looking at some trends overseas and how it might impact the U.S. Fiscal situation. Senator Heraclitus has been interested in that issue as well. It's not surprising since he's interested and vigilant about all threats to the U.S. fiscal outlook, and held hearings on this earlier this year. So when Concord began thinking about put a paper on this, we thought it would be good to get some input from Senator Conrad to share his perspectives to tee up our conference this morning. So I'm very pleased to present to you the new one, our 2010 Paul Tsongas Economic Patriot Award, and a true deficit hawk, Senator Kent Conrad.
Thank you, Robert, and thanks everybody for being up early this morning and have a chance to be here to visit about an additional challenge that we confront, not only obviously in Europe, but the effects that might have here. It is, I think, something that is increasingly caught the attention of policymakers in the United States. We've had a chance to have European leaders come before various caucuses in the last several weeks, give us their perspective on what was happening. And today that what I would do is kind of put in context what's happening here, and then talk a little bit about what's happening there might have effects in our country. I always thought it useful to kind of go back and put in perspective how to where we are today. Because it's amazing, but some of our colleagues forget a bit of the history leading up to conditions we confront today. So look at the economic crisis back in 2008 and 2009. We can be reminded that we had the worst recession since the Great Depression. In the fourth quarter of 2008, the economy was actually shrinking at a rate of almost 9%. Pretty alarming. In January of 2009 alone, we lost 800,000 jobs in a month. The housing market was in crisis. Home building and sales were plummeting. We faced record foreclosures. And the financial market crisis threatened a global economic collapse. I do not use words lightly. I stand in England. When I talk about collapse, I mean collapse. And I will never forget, as long as I live, being called in late 2008 to an emergency meeting in the Capitol in the Majority Leader's office. Last one to arrive because I'd been chairing a meeting of a group of 10 that was focused on an end policy for the United States. I walk in and here are the leaders of the House and the Senate, Republicans and Democrats, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve, and the Secretary of the Treasury. And the markets closed. And they informed us they were going to take over AIG the next morning, and they told us if they did not, they believed there would be a financial collapse within 10 days. And they went into specific detail what companies in the United States would collapse because of ties to AIG contracts. I don't think anybody left that meeting without understanding we were headed into uncharted territory. There are the TARP negotiations, and I'll never forget, as long as I lived, the last night of the TARP negotiations. We were negotiating late into the night Saturday, and at midnight, the Secretary of the Treasury told us if we did not reach conclusion by 5 o'clock Sunday evening, the markets would open and they would collapse. Our own markets would open the next morning and they would collapse. While we were negotiating, the Secretary of the Treasury kept getting messages on his BlackBerry of financial institutions that were going down all across Europe, financial institutions, and the instantaneous decisions their governments were making to rescue them to prevent a collapse. In fact, that night, the Secretary of the Treasury himself collapsed. It was a remarkable night. Again, I'll never forget it. So that's what was happening in 2008. Let's go to the next slide. If we go back to those days and we look at GDP growth, you can see that fourth quarter 2008 shrunk 9%. The next quarter shrunk 7%. And then as the stimulus and TARP took hold, we moved back to growth. Really quite a remarkable turnaround, given how serious the financial situation was in this country and in other countries as well. Those who say stimulus and TARP didn't work, really? If that failure, I wonder what would they call success? Because it looks to me like it worked. Now, not as well as we might have liked. Thus, in a financial crisis as deep and serious as the one we confronted in 2008, to get this kind of turnaround that quickly is really quite remarkable. Let's go to the next slide, because we see a jobs picture as well. Again, in January of 2009, we lost more than 800,000 just in a month. Now we've, again, as stimulus and TARP took hold, returned to growth in January of 2010. And since then, it's been uneven, especially weighted down, I believe, by what's happening in Europe in the most recent months, because it has really introduced a note of uncertainty in our own business community. Let's go to the next slide. And frankly, also weighted down by the fiscal drag created by governments. When you put federal government, state, and local together, there is fiscal drag occurring because government is being quite sharply downsized. Not at the federal level, but state and local. And when you put it all together, the combined effect is the fiscal drag at the governmental level. So, Carmen Reinhart and Vincent Reinhart wrote a study after the fall, and one of the key findings was that real per capita GDP growth rates are significantly lower during the decade following severe financial crises. In the 10-year window following severe financial crises, unemployment rates are significantly higher than in the decade that preceded the crisis. So, even though the previous charts I showed you demonstrated quite a rapid recovery here, what we know is after financial crises, the recovery is slower to take root than after more normal economic downturns. That's why I thought, frankly, the paper that was put out in the middle of this recovery that suggested we were going to have a more robust recovery than we're having was just wrong. I'll never forget when I heard this prediction, we were only at 8% unemployment. That modeling was done based on the recoveries from, I think, the last 7 or 8 recoveries that we've experienced since World War II. The problem with that analysis was, and I believe is, that it's not a typical downturn. This downturn where real damage was done to the financial sector, and it takes time to rebuild the balance sheets. It takes time to rebuild the capital of financial institutions, and that means you've got a longer recovery period. Let's go to the next slide if we can. Interestingly enough, if we look at economic growth in major areas of the world, our major competitors, you can see that we're doing quite a bit better than global competition. Now, I didn't put China in here because they're not in the same category as the Eurozone or Japan or the United Kingdom. But look at how we're doing compared to the Eurozone, Japan, the United Kingdom. And of course, the most recent data from the United Kingdom shows their downturn intensifying. Eurozone is now weakening. We'll get into that in a minute. But you see the United States has done better than other developed countries and regions. Let's go to the next slide. So holding back our recovery. Why aren't we seeing more robust growth? Why are we seeing job creation slip? Well, I think there are a lot of reasons. Among them, the European debt and financial crisis has thrown a cloud over global markets, and I think it's undeniable. I talk to business leaders virtually every day. The message I'm getting from them is really clear and consistent. Yesterday I met with a man that's on the board of Ford. They're about to close 4 plants in Europe. In the board meeting that made this decision, he asked what the other automobile manufacturers are doing, and he was told they're doing the same thing. And we could see a substantial increase in unemployment as these plants close in Europe. Second, political deadlock on fiscal issues here creates an add to uncertainty. You all know the fiscal cliff, and we'll get into what the fiscal cliff is all about in a minute, but that political deadlock that was demonstrated here around extension of the debt limit also shook confidence and created uncertainty. Federal, state, and local government cutbacks create economic drag. This is what I referenced earlier. When you hit all of government, federal, state, and local, there is fiscal drag. There are shrinkage in the employment in all government. Put it all together, federal, state, local, there's shrinkage, and that's adding to fiscal drag. How it continues to pose a threat, we still see places in the country where many people are upside down. Florida, Arizona, Nevada, probably the most prominent of the markets where we see real continuing weakness and adverse economic effects as a result. Then we have the situation in the Middle East with Iran, the uncertainty about what might happen there, and an understanding that Iran is threatened in various ways to close the Straits of Hormuz. That would have significant impacts in the oil markets and residual economic adverse effects as well. We believe are things that are holding us back. When we got the European response to what's happened there, I was especially drawn to this by Gerhard Schroeder, and pulled out this one paragraph, and I'd like to just read it for you because while I don't agree with all of his column, there is a piece of it that I do think deserves our attention. He said this: the direction of European economic and financial policy must change away from pure austerity toward growth. Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Italy, and Spain have made substantial progress on stabilizing their finances, which is true. You look at what they've done in terms of getting deficits and debt going in a better direction. They've made measurable progress. But the economic and political situation in these countries shows that austerity alone is not the way to resolve the crisis. On the contrary, there is a danger of half-strangling national economies with a strict policy of austerity. We'd therefore be well advised to cushion harsh austerity measures with programs for growth. And this is the trick, isn't it? How do you harmonize these conflicting needs? How do you deal with the need to get your long-term fiscal picture in better shape, at the same time not add to fiscal drag, not intensify the downturn? My view is what is required is really a two-step approach. Step one, steps strengthen the economy in the short term, and I'm especially drawn to, in this country, our needs around infrastructure, as we have serious infrastructure deficits as well, and puts lots of people to work and puts them to the work here in our country. I know that there is this notion that you can't do it quickly enough. I submit to you, if we had done more on this measure back in 2009, we'd be in better shape today, because much of it would be hitting right now as we see some weakness in the economy. So step one, short-term steps to strengthen the economy. Again, I am very attracted to dealing with infrastructure deficits as well. I remember a little debate Larry Summers and I had around this question in 2009. He was arguing against money of infrastructure because of the time getting it implemented. I asked him, how long did it take to build the Pentagon? Anybody know? How long did it take to build the Pentagon?
18 months.
9 months. 9 months. This idea we can't do it. I mean, I don't know what we've gotten in our heads here. We can't do things. You can do it. Now, does it take extraordinary measures? Yeah. You just follow, every jot and tittle of existing law and do that. But you waive certain things. But a story in North Dakota, 2007, we faced devastating floods. You perhaps remember the floods of Grand Forks, because it got a lot of national play, because we were facing a flood in the midst of a blizzard, and then a fire broke out. So here we have a blizzard, a flood, and a fire engulfing much of downtown Grand Forks, all at the same time. We got calling up James Lee with FEMA. Essentially, some of these regulations are really preventing us from making the progress we need to make to help this town recover. So what regulations are you complaining about? I get a list of 4 or 5. They're all waived. They're all waived. And James Lee, have you got the authority to do that? He said, I did it. They're all waived. He said, look, I trust you guys. Don't embarrass us. Use good judgment. But go out and do what has to be done. Don't worry about these regulations later. We can do this. But we've gotten caught up in a kind of a bureaucratic maze that we can't change the way we do things when we face a crisis. I just reject that. Let's go to the next. Downturn deepens in the Eurozone. This was July 25th, which would be yesterday, as you recall. Y'all recall July 25th? Birthday. But look at this. I don't know if you can see this well. I apologize for that. But what the subhead says is this: manufacturing and services output shrinks in Germany. France, in Greece, debt inspectors seem pessimistic on progress. Well, there's a surprise, isn't it? The Greeks, this is a major news headline. Greeks are not meeting. Their agreement. Shocking. Who would have thought? Here we are. Eurozone is the first chart there, and you're seeing this is the manufacturer's outlook, and you can see Eurozone in the red there. Germany moved just into the red. France, kind of a double dip. We're seeing that across Europe. Spain got the latest report. Looks like they're going to be going more rapidly in reverse. So we see a real downturn in the Eurozone, and we had the same information from Great Britain. Their downturn intensifying. Looks like a double dip there as well. Let's go to the next slide. Alan. So, Eurozone economy is slowing. 2011, we saw growth, pretty tepid. 2012, we've moved into negative territory for the Eurozone. What we saw there in Germany, France, Spain, being repeated in the Eurozone as a whole. What Alan Blinder, one of my favorite economists, said about this: my rough outlook for GDP growth in the U.S. for calendar year 2012 is about 2.5%. The big threat to the economy is financial contagion from Europe. It really goes to what the conference is all about. In a worst-case scenario, a European financial blow-up that looks somewhat like Lehman Brothers, I think almost all, if not all, of that putative 2.5% growth could just evaporate in worldwide recession. Alan Blinder is also somebody that uses words carefully, and when he uses words like this, I think we all ought to pay attention. Go to the next slide. So, our connection to Europe, I think you all know it very well. It is a major trading partner. 22% of U.S. exports were bought by Europe. Asia, excluding China, was 23%. China was 7%. So if you put Asia and China together, they're 30%. But Europe's 22%. Significantly ahead of Canada at 19%. So look, the major trading partners, when they have problems, we have problems. Without a doubt. That shows us clearly Europe is entering an additional downturn that's going to have effects here. Let's go to the next slide. Now, earlier about the fiscal cliff that we face here. I'm often asked by people, what are we talking about when we talk about the fiscal cliff? And these are the elements that we face coming at us very, very soon. $1.2 trillion across-the-board sequester in domestic spending that starts to take effect in the first part of next year. Second, 2001 and 2003 tax cuts are all expiring. If you put those two events together, CEO has told us that could lead to an economic downturn here, a recession in the United States. The alternative, minimum tax, needs to be fixed, or it will come back at us and affect tens of millions of people, and also add drag. The extenders are expiring or have already expired, things like research and development tax credit, all of the other extenders. Fix is needed. Or our doctors who treat Medicare patients will face a 27% cut. A pay tax cut is expiring at the end of the year. I don't expect that will be extended, but nonetheless, that's an additional factor to consider. Unemployment insurance extension is expiring, and the granddaddy of them all, the debt limit, is going to have to be extended early next year. So that's the so-called fiscal cliff. Obviously, that has a lot of risk associated with these events occurring at roughly the same time. The economic effects would be, I think, quite damaging. But it also provides an incentive to act. There's one thing that is clear. It requires external pressure to get colleagues to act, to do things that are tough to do. And I'm not being hypercritical here. I understand. I'm in the political world. I've run for office. I'm not running again, but I've done it many times. I know the pressure that our colleagues, the things that have to be done are not popular. I'm asked repeatedly, what's the biggest impediment to getting the grand bargain? And the biggest impediment is public opinion. Because Congress, like it or not, large reflects public opinion. These people are elected. Many of them want to be re-elected. They know if they're going against public opinion, their chances of re-election are greatly diminished. So, at the end of the day here, people say they want to fix the deficit and debt problem, but when you ask them the specifics of what it would take, they reject virtually every one. You're going to term entitlements? 40% say, no, don't change entitlements. Don't change Social Security and Medicare. Well, 70%. Well, how revenue side of the equation? To have some additional revenue? By over 6%, they say no. Want to do that. But reducing at least the increase in deficit by over 60%, they reject that option. So now you're getting down to domestic discretionary spending again, which is 20% of the budget. And when you ask them the specifics, you want to cut education? No. You want to cut law enforcement? No. You want to cut education? No. The one they're willing to cut on the spending side of the equation by a majority is foreign aid. And I think that may be because they've seen Simon Johnson on television, hold him responsible for what's happened here, and they're willing to cut anything that might be associated with it. So what good does it do us if we cut foreign aid? Anybody know how much foreign aid is of the budget? Yeah, 1%. Well, when you're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar you spend, eliminate foreign aid, you've taken care of 1/40th of the problem. So obviously that's not the answer. The thing that they will support by a majority is increasing taxes on the wealthy. How we define wealthy. They're willing to do that by a pretty strong majority. Okay, do the math on that. If we we solve this problem by taxing the wealthy, we have tax rates in 70% range, which would do wonders for our competitive position. So, look, I personally believe that we've got to do a much better job of educating the public on how you address this problem, what the consequences of failure would be, and that we have to have a strategy that demonstrates we can walk and chew gum at the same time. That's why I get back to this two-step approach. One, in the short term, additional measures to give strength to an economy that is faltering in the context of long-term reform. And long-term reforms, I believe, that clearly present themselves. Our need to fix our entitlement programs, Medicare and Social Security, are unsustainable over time. And I am a fervent defender and believer in Medicare and Social Security. I believe it helped transform America. But I believe if you really care about Social Security and Medicare, then you ought to care about putting them on a sustainable course. And the same is true on the revenue side of the equation. Let's go to the next slide. I've made this point. We're borrowing 40 cents of every dollar. This is a slide that I think gets too little attention. Going back to 1950, look at spending and revenues. The outlays of the United States, the spending is the red line. And UP in 2012, we are pretty close to a 60-year high. We've come a bit off, was the high in 2010. But look at the revenue side of the equation, the green line. We are at or near a 60-year low on revenue. So some colleagues say this is a spending problem. Yeah, in part spending problem, they got it half right. This is so a revenue problem. And how any serious person can look at this and not conclude that you've got to work on both the spending side of the equation and the revenue side of the equation, because after all, it is the difference between spending and revenue that leads to deficits and accumulated deficits that are our debt. And how we've got to help people understand that this is the actual situation that we confront. Let's go to the next this is our gross debt. And we use gross debt. I know economists like to look at another measure of debt, publicly held debt. And I'm focusing on gross debt because in the work that was done looking at debt situations in the past, they focused on gross debt. And here we are. Our gross debt in 2012 is going to be 104% of GDP. The work by Rogoff and Reinhardt indicated, after looking at over 200 years of economic history, dozens of countries, that when you get to gross debt of more than 90% of GDP, your future economic prospects are diminished. What do I mean by that? Future economic growth is weakened, and measurably so. That's when you get to gross debt of more than 90% of GDP. Well, we've passed that. We're 104%. Now, obviously, as you get deeper into that territory, the effects on future economic growth intensify. We're just at the beginning. We've got time here to respond and to act, but we've reached the danger zone. And so I think that makes it more clear that we really need to respond. Let me just read from, let's go back to that one. So I didn't. We have the experience of 44 countries spanning up to 2 centuries of data on central government debt, inflation, and growth. Our main finding is that across both advanced countries and emerging markets, high debt to GDP levels, 90% and above, and again, they're using gross debt, not publicly held debt, gross debt, are associated with notably lower growth outcomes. Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff. We can come and testify before the Bowles-Simpson Commission. One of my colleagues was sitting next to me during their presentation. In the middle of the presentation, he turned to me and he said, "Do you think this is true?" I said, I do believe it's true. I think, if you just think through all the interactions here, that debt matters. And if debt matters, obviously deficits matter. Let's go to the next. So, looking at it from a different vantage point, the Congressional Budget Office, that's nonpartisan, has provided this long-term outlook to us, saying, and this is not gross debt, this is publicly held debt. Do kind of a simple mathematical calculation. Gross debt is 100%, publicly held debt is about 30 points lower, so about 70%. That's not precisely accurate, but it's a good rule of thumb. So, 100% publicly held debt, 70%. All of the things I've been showing you to this point have been gross debt because that's the measure that Reinhardt and Rogoff used. CBO, this is publicly held debt. And on publicly held debt, they're telling us by 2037 we'll be at 200% of GDP, publicly held debt. So I don't know what could be more clear. We're on a course here that doesn't make any sense. We've got to change course. That, to me, does not believe amid austerity. That would be another mistake. I think the Europeans are seeing that. If you're going to take steps, give you some lift in the short term, that makes your long-term problem worse. That's also undeniable. So, to me, you've got to do 2 things at once. You've got to give short-term lift, but at the same time, you've got to reform the drivers of your long-term debt proposition. And you look at what are your long-term drivers. They're the entitlement programs. It's not domestic discretionary spending. Interesting enough, that's the pot we keep going back to. That's where we keep cutting. That isn't really the source of our problem. Doesn't mean we can't do things there. Certainly we have some savings, further savings in defense, further savings in non-defense. But the place where we've got the big challenge are the entitlement accounts. That's Social Security, and the biggest of all, the biggest opportunity of all, the healthcare accounts. And of course, the revenue side of the equation. So my own belief is, short term, we ought to do things to let this economy give lift. Long term, we ought to be addressing the entitlements and tax reform, but we ought to make those reforms now and do it in a way that demonstrates credibility to the markets that we're serious about getting back on track. Is that last?
Yeah.
Let me stop there, and I appreciate your patience. I've tried to lay out quite a bit here, but I say to you, these are critical times, and we get smart about how we get back on track. And with people like you paying attention and helping to educate others, I'm pretty confident we can get this right, or at least mostly right. Thank you very much. I don't know if there's time left for questions, or we've... One of my colleagues told me, Kent, after you give a speech, you immediately have to hand out industrial strength Prozac. So maybe it's best if we don't have questions. Thank you.
Wait. That's right. Yeah. Are we all in the same time? Would it be better on the other?
Yeah, but then still have to.
No, that is our job.
I think we.
Switch over there. But then, There we go.
We can adjust to that.
Yeah, that's better.
So, good morning. My name is Andrews, and I'll be moderating our discussion this morning. Our panelists, I'm not anonymous. I'm a long-term economics correspondent, and I also had the good fortune to spend 6 years in Europe during the run-up and launch of Euro from 1996 to 2002. So I was watching all of this with great interest. At the time the currency union came together after all of those negotiations, and it's gone to see what's happened now since the financial crisis happened. So that seeming hard work to pull the European economies together, which seemed to be working for a while, kind of blew apart. This morning, we've got a very distinguished panel. Our focus here at the Concord Coalition is to just pick up the subject of the European debt crisis in a slightly different light than usual. We've all been talking about, thinking about, and worrying about events in Europe, watching the drama day in and day out for the last couple of years. Concord Coalition has been focused for all of its history on the U.S. fiscal condition and an advocate for policies to get us on a more sustainable fiscal path in this country. The question before us today really is, okay, as we look at the European crisis, one, what are the lessons that we may be able to draw from there? And number two, what are the impacts on us? And Americans have traditionally had basically two versions of Europe and the European debt crisis. One is that this is sort of that their problems are essentially a problem of reckless government spending and borrowing, and number two, that whatever was happening there didn't really have that much direct effect on the United States. Both of those things are kind of wrong. There is a spending problem in a number of European countries, but it's very clear that, maybe with the exception of Greece, their problems have at least as much to do with currency and with economies that got out of line. Spain actually had a slight budget surplus a couple of years ago, and Ireland did too. So we're in a situation. So a lot of the sort of easy assumptions about Europe are wrong, and we wanted to take a sort of a clear look and parse, tease some of the details out. And the second assumption that Americans have often had, and rightfully, is that we could sort of go on our merry way, and even if there are crises elsewhere in the world, we got through the Mexican crisis back in the early 90s, we got through the Asian crisis. We've seen Europe have slow growth for a long time. Didn't seem to stop us, but I think that that is different now. Ever since the financial crisis here, the U.S. is itself vulnerable on a domestic front, and I think we are very much more dependent than we used to be on the real world for our growth. We're not the engine right now. We may not be for a while. Anyway, with all that, let me introduce our panel and get us started. I'd like to hold us to 5 minutes so we can keep as much time open for discussion. Our panelists, to get right, Diane Lim Rogers, who is Chief Economist at the Concord Coalition, has a long and distinguished career before that as Chief Economist on House Budget Committee, has worked in, was in President Clinton, an economist on President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors, and has been deeply immersed in all of these subjects for many years. Doug Elliott from the Brookings Institution, a longtime investment banker, but a very, very keen eye on both financial regulatory issues and fiscal issues, and he's been watching the European crisis very closely and commenting on it and testifying before Congress on it. Has a lot to say. Simon Onsen, MIT professor. Are you still with the Teachers Institute?
Yes.
Yes, that's what I thought. More credits than we can run off in the time we have available. Author of 12 Bankers and most.
Well, maybe they're down to 12 now.
Was it 13? Sorry. And White House Burning, most recently. And Joe Minarik, host here at the City for Economic Development, and also a true veteran and wise voice on the Hill for many years on fiscal policy. Was also a lead participant in the Bipartisan Policy Center's Debt Reduction Task Force. So we've got a great group to launch this off. I think we'll start with Diane, who's going to quickly run us through, give us a quick tour of salient economic points, and then.
There is a paper that we released today, Concord Coalition released today, not just their problem, and so this is available on our website, I believe. And so I'm just going to run through very quickly some of the charts, and I'll just set up some. It basically raises a lot of questions more than providing answers. So we've looked at some of the data across countries just to put the U.S. situation in a more global context, which is a little bit unusual for Concord. So it's just the charts in the paper are consistent with what Senator Conrad was emphasizing. The fact that the U.S. economy is so dependent on the rest of the world's economy, and especially financially, global markets are most connected financially. So rather than, we are dependent on exports, on Europe for demand for our exports, but even more than that, our financial markets are very tied. So this is just a correlation of U.S. and global European stock markets. Let's go on to the next slide. We've had a synchronized global downturn. All countries' growth has slowed together, and similarly, in the next chart, we can see that our prospects for recovery are fairly weak as well. This has been a very slow kind of recovery. The next two charts in the paper just look at in debt as a share of GDP across the world. So the first chart is gross debt. So Senator Conrad mentioned gross debt in the context of the 90% of GDP threshold that Rogoff and Reinhardt emphasized. The next chart is net debt. These are just designed to show that we're kind of all in the same boat. The patterns are very similar. Obviously, Greece is in much shape, Greece and Japan in terms of debt burden, but we are in much the same boat. And yet, one of my puzzles in looking at some of this global data was in this next chart is that, the U.S. actually has very low interest rates. So despite the fact that we have high debt burdens as a share of GDP projected to get worse, dramatically worse over time, we and Japan and Germany and United Kingdom, we enjoy incredibly low interest rates in contrast to much of the rest of the world. And so there's a huge variance in the faith that global investors seem to have in the safety of U.S. Treasuries versus other sovereign debt instruments. Charts 7 and 8 are designed to show, so we'll chart 7 first. This is from OECD data, a measure of the so-called fiscal gap. This is the rise in the balance, basically the surplus balance, annual balance, needed to bring gross debt to 50% of GDP by 2050. You can see the U.S. on this chart is third worst. If you go to the next chart is IMF data. Similar concept, slightly different measure. It's the primary balance required, the difference between the primary balance required to stabilize net debt to 60% of GDP by 2030 and the current policy position of our country. So if you look at that chart, the U.S. is actually second to worst, just behind Japan. And interest rates are still so low. So it's somewhat of a puzzle. But if you think about what most of these organizations are measuring in terms of fiscal gap, it's the gap between where we are in terms of current fiscal policy and where we need to be to stabilize the debt. Our interest rates are largely a reflection of the confidence that the world has, not just in our current fiscal policy stance, but basically our underlying economy, our economic strength. And I think that's what distinguishes the U.S. from some of these other countries in Europe, is that our fiscal gap looks very large, and yet our economic capacity to close that gap is probably much deeper. Our capacity is much deeper than many of these European countries. In the paper, we released a new analysis by former Moody's analyst Mark Jaffe, who's here in the audience today. It's a model that estimates the probability of so-called fiscal crisis. And Mark defines as a fiscal crisis point the point at which interest payments on the debt exceed 30% of federal revenue. So it's a measure of the burden of the debt relative to our economic capacity, or fiscal capacity at least. And in that measure, Mark shows us that by 2040, there's a greater than 50% chance that we cross that threshold. This is a cumulative probability over time. Within the next 10 years, there's only a 10% chance that we'll cross that threshold. Now, Mark's model is unique in that CBO used to do these probability estimates. CBO used to do this so-called fan chart. Some people called it a fan chart that showed a probability distribution of budget projections going off in the future because budget projections are so uncertain. We used to do this chart, but it was based on sort of projections of budget, current policy, current law policy, because they're forced to current policy, current law policy. Mark has the interesting feature in his model is that there's different sources of uncertainty in his model, economic, but there's also political uncertainty. He has some variance in terms of whether we're likely to stay closer to current law, which is fiscal cliff, go over or run into the fiscal cliff, or current policy, which is continue to deficit finance, spending, and tax cuts going forward. And so Mark uses a probability distribution on that. I like to conclude by mentioning that I think that it seems like this whole question of how we're dependent on Europe and the rest of the world, it sort of feels like we're on a teeter-totter. I don't know if when I was a kid, there were teeter-totters in playgrounds. They got rid of them because they were so unsafe. Sometimes they're called seesaw. But I sort of picture us, we're kind of all balancing on this teeter-totter together. And if you remember being on a teeter-totter, it's bad if either your partner suddenly crashes down to the bottom or just gets off the teeter-totter. Either way, it's not a good outcome for you on the opposite end of the teeter-totter, and I sort of feel like that's what's going on with our dependency, our codependency in terms of fiscal and economic policy more broadly.
Joe?
Okay. Harry, if you would just go to the first slide. I have did a few slides. I'm going to do only one for purposes of our discussion.
The long one.
Just what I have, it doesn't matter. First slide.
Okay.
No, it matters. We'll skip the paragraph. It's an unknown threat.
Wow.
Keep going. Highly uncertain economic environment, very complex, very few people can get a hold of it. It's like the dictum of the Greek philosopher Heraclitus, who said, "You can never step into the same cesspool twice. The cesspool always changes." You're going to hit a substantive slide. This is it. We'll stick here. I thought this was the first slide. Sorry. This is to emphasize a point that was made earlier, which I think is extremely important, and it gets down to the issue, an issue that I'm going to try to distill here. This is the, if you will, the economic performance of countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It's a very large population of countries, as you can see. The point is not for you to pick out individual lines. The point is rather, I use this chart very often in talking to students. I make especially to the young women in the audience is if you go from the left side of this chart towards the right side, you have a mass of tangled and crossing lines. As you get towards the time in the chart, which is the middle 2000s, if you think about your conditioner, your cream rinse for your shampoo, all of a sudden everything flows together. We had a synchronized period of economic growth in the late 2000s, which it turns out was not sustainable, and after that we had a synchronized economic downturn. So a point is made in the paper, but it bears reinforcing. One of the parts of our current environment that is unprecedented and much a matter for concern is that economies all around the world are comparatively weak. What you had at the left side of this chart, and going back historically, was diversity of economic performance around the world, and that diversity gave an element of stability. The strong countries at any given moment could help to support the weak countries through their demand which made its way through global markets for exports and imports. It could be that the United States was a substantial locomotive, the undisputed global leader, as Ed suggested earlier, a kind of a flywheel, if you will, for the economic engine of the world. It used to be that the United States was much more independent of developments around the rest of the world. One of the points the paper makes right now is that U.S. exports have constituted about 13% of our GDP recently. If you go back far enough for an old guy like me, I remember when that number was 5. So trade is substantially more important to the U.S. economy right now, and even more important for supplying economic growth recently. Another point that's made in the paper that I think is very much worth repeating is that the problem that Europe constitutes for the United States right now is not just the strictly defined financial crisis. It's not as though if the European Monetary Union manages to stick together and avoids a breakup of the euro, that everything will be fine and dandy. The problem for the United States is that we are dependent now heavily, as Senator Conrad also showed you earlier, on exports to Europe. And if you think about it, it is not just bilateral trade relationships that are important. We have other parts of the world that sell to Europe, so if European demand falls, global demand will fall, global trade will decline, and it will come back and support the United States. So, key point, we are not just talking about European financial survival, we are talking about the performance of the European economy as being important in our own economic growth. So, I want one final point and help to move on to my colleagues here, whom I'm very happy to welcome, and that's why I made all those muffins out front. And I hope the economic environment right now is extraordinarily different from anything we have seen in our living memory. Almost to the point saying, I think it's almost fair to say unique. Since World War II, the United States' position as the undisputed economic engine, locomotive, flywheel of the U.S. economy, if you will, has gradually declined much more so in recent years. So we have an economy globally that is significantly different from what we've had before. We also have this recent development in terms of the institution of the euro, and now this serious problem of diversity within the European Monetary Union causing instability and concerns about their currency. The United States right now, as we've seen in a number of the charts that have been presented here, extraordinarily weak in terms of its fiscal performance, and at the same time enjoying extraordinarily low interest rates. Bob Bixby, the president of the Concord Coalition, said a while ago that if you think about it, the United States is almost one consumer responding to a teaser loan with temporary low interest rates. We are piling up debt to the extent that when interest rates rise, is going to be an extraordinary increase in the U.S. debt burden. And it happened even in a growing economy, which almost makes it more scary because we could have an economic recovery in the United States that could be threatened by rising interest rates, getting into a vicious circle with the debt service cost of the federal government reinforcing each other to the point where we could have a fiscal and financial explosion. Right now, the United States and the world share a need for an anchor. In uncertain, unprecedented environment, one of the most important things that the United States could do would be to establish the kind of fiscal program going forward that, perhaps beyond a period of fiscal stimulus, would give an indication to the world that the United States will remain fiscally and financially sound. If we did that, it would give an element to the world economy of stability and confidence that could help the rest of the world to grow. It would also, incidentally, extremely good for the United States, because if we established our fiscal financial credibility, we retain for years access to very low capital on global markets. Would be a very nice thing, considering that we have a lot of needs in our economy going forward for investment in infrastructure as well as for investment in productive private capital, so that our economy can continue to grow. So there's both a need and an opportunity for us to get our own fiscal house in order, and that would be good for Europe, it would be good for us, and we should do that promptly.
Good. Thank you. We need an anchor. Do you have thoughts on whether we can be that anchor? You wrote just this week the situation in Europe get worse before it gets better, but margin do we all have here to play around?
I think we have a lot of margin. I'm focused on Europe, actually, and not answer your question.
Okay.
But before I do that,
It was a nice gesture.
Exactly. At least I'm being straightforward about that, answering your question. Given this is a fiscal policy crowd, I do also want to mention briefly, I wrote a book at the end of last year on the federal government's credit programs. First comprehensive look at about 25 years of that. So if any of you are interested, it's Uncle Sam and Pinstripes Evaluating Federal Credit Programs. It hasn't got massive play, which I mentioned. For some odd reason, it's not in the New York Times bestseller list, like I'm sure Simon's supposed to. Coming here, one of the things I've been trying to emphasize to people, and for me, I'm going to oversimplify wildly, given I have about 4 minutes left. Well, one of the things I emphasize for people is a reason we talk past each other about the Euro crisis is it's not one crisis. It's at least 6, depending on how you define it. It's a competitiveness crisis in many of the countries of Europe. It's a fiscal crisis in some of the same European countries and some others. It's a crisis of European-level institutions. It's a crisis of national political institutions. It's a financial crisis in the sense of a financial system, banking crisis. And then, as a result of all these things, it's a crisis of market confidence in the sovereign debt of these countries. And these have different time frames. Sometimes they need somewhat different solutions. So it's important to keep in mind what we're talking about. I would say, as a big picture point, this is more a political crisis than an economic crisis. There are important economic elements, but if you look at the euro area as a whole, they're fiscally stronger than we are. They can handle this. They have, it's hard to get exactly similar measurements. Their debt levels are about where ours are in terms of relationship to the size of the economy, and their deficits are a lot better than ours are, taken as a whole. I think it's something like 3% of GDP for the Eurozone. So the problem is that if you're in the market, and I'm mostly focused on the short-term market confidence problem here, because I think that's what's going to blow up first. If you're in the market, you don't know when you own a Spanish bond, if you own a bond that's effectively backed by the entire Eurozone, in which case you shouldn't charge much at all, or whether you really have a Spanish bond, in which case you should be charging a hell of a lot. The truth is somewhere in between. As pieces of news come out that make the market feel better or worse about the extent to which the Eurozone is going to stand behind their members, this is one reason you see contagion effects on the rates in Europe. It's not crazy that when something happens in Spain, it can move Italian bond rates, because it's an indication of what the rest of Europe might do, what the capacity and willingness is to help back up all of the troubled countries. My own prognosis, or that's the right medical term or not, what I think will happen is, as Ed pointed out, I do believe that the euro area will have to get worse before it gets better. This is because there are really terribly cruel political constraints on almost all the major players. You see it particularly in Germany, but it's in pretty much all of the euro area countries. And what I'm meaning is that the nations and the institutions like the European Central Bank can't go to where I think they need to go because of those political constraints until they're standing on the edge of the cliff. And they feel sometimes like they've been at the edge of the cliff, but they haven't been yet. They've a few steps back where you can still kind of enjoy the view. So what I think personally will happen is that we'll get to the point where either Spain or Italy loses market access. That could happen fairly quickly with Spain. If either one does, I think the other one will, because the markets are very skeptical that there's enough money to back both Italy and Spain combined with everybody else who's already needed help. So if you have a program for Spain, it leaves the market feeling there's very little backup anymore for Italy. I think the European leaders can live with that result. They're going to have to go to what I see as the ultimate summit, where they finally do the things that they should have done earlier. And one of the bad things about the political constraints is, if the European leaders had ever done at one summit what they ended up doing at the next summit, this would all have been solved at far lower cost. I think we're at the point where what they're going to have to do is their version of the grand bargain, which is that Germany and the fiscally strong countries and the ECB agree that there will be some form of mutualization of debt. So if you have an Italian bond, you really are owning effectively a Euro bond. There are multiple ways to do it. Mechanism isn't nearly as important as the fact of it. ECB in the short run will have to buy a lot of bonds because anything that's being done will take some time to happen. The IMF will need to come in for its credibility. The peripheral countries are going to have to give up a lot of sovereignty, and you probably want to fix the banking crisis at the same time. So this is all difficult. I think there's about a 3 in 4 chance that they will do what they have to do, and they will muddle through after that. The 1 in 4 chance they won't makes me a pessimist when I'm talking to Europeans, an optimist in U.S. terms, and when I speak on China about this, they think I'm a raving lunatic optimist.
Great. Simon. Great. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here and for these great presentations. And thanks for honoring and putting Senator Conrad in front of us for his brilliant sweeping remarks. I thought he was too optimistic. Frankly. I think we are missing important dimensions of the severity of what is hitting Europe and what will hit us. Let me highlight 3 reasons. And in the interest of time, let me lay out my baseline scenario view here. There are many nuances, some of which have already been expressed, and we can get into. But the three points I would make are, first of all, the Eurozone crisis is profound. As Ed mentioned, it's a crisis of the currency zone, of the currency arrangement. It is compounded by public finance weakness in some countries. And this is the second point, and I think what we've missed, the banking system. Now, of course, we all understand that there was a bubble, unsustainable increase in asset prices in recent years. It underpins many of the problems we've experienced in this country and around the world. But what exactly was the nature of that bubble? I like to say it was U.S. housing prices. They certainly went up and then down. But I would suggest, if you look much more broadly, look for the common elements. Look, the Eurozone, for example, was able to finance the positions in Greece, the public debt. Look at what happened in Ireland and Spain. Ed mentioned correctly that countries did not have an iron fiscal problem in the run-up to 2008 as conventionally measured. Turned out they were sitting on huge contingent liabilities. Their case is perhaps the most clear cut, but I think Spain will soon do the same. Ireland's debt was 25% of GDP. It looked fiscally prudent. Probably everybody in this room, including myself, thought that they were fiscally conservative. They weren't. They were taking massive risks throughout allowing three banks to become very large relative to the economy, to become high leverage, to bet a great deal on a very limited number of assets, and to find that offshore. This is powder keg economics, and it bothers me a great deal. Then clear thinking fiscal analysts, like my friends at the Congressional Budget Office, I'm on that panel of economic advisors, and they listen to me, but they haven't moved enough in this direction. They do not score for the budget appropriate or even at all contingent liabilities arising from highly leveraged, oversized, quote-unquote, too big to fail financial system in the United States. The Concord Coalition, which I think has done fantastic work on any dimensions of exactly what we need, which is Senator Conrad shifting public opinion, educating people about what are the fiscal risks. I'm not aware that you've done anything on this dimension of contingent liabilities. The surge in the United States from 2008 through to 2018, due to the financial crisis, due to the severity of the financial crisis, back out from the CBO's economic and debt projections. That surge, due to the depth, the severity, intensity of that crisis, which you've all shown and talked about, 50% of GDP, 50% of GDP when all is said and done, call that $7 or $8 trillion increase in debt. That's the second largest debt surge in United States history, second only to World War II. I know why I fought World War II. I know what we got out of World War II. I have no idea, none, what we got out of the debt bubble and oversized banking freeze, which wasn't just the United States, it was across almost all of the industrialized. And that led me to a very specific, concrete proposal I would like to put to the Commission and to the Committee for Economic Development. Anybody thinks hard about fiscal responsibility, the risks coming to us potentially. I mean, I may be right, I may be right, but it's going to be a turbulent ride. There's a lot of damage coming. I would suggest, in my view, Greece leaves the euro in the next 3 months. Its debt is restructured. That's 2 trillion euros in debt being restructured. Big problems for the French banking system coming out of this. You'll be questioning this time next year, perhaps. You'll be questioning the extent to which the French government now stands behind big banks such as SocGen and BNP Paribas. Not to be in full default, but selective choosing of which creditors get paid in cash and which ones get some French treasury obligation that matures in 2040. Absolutely. Effect on the U.S. banks. What is the full degree of the exposure of our banks today? For example, their derivative positions, party risks, with all of the Eurozone. I don't know. The stated balance sheet under U.S. GAAP of J.P. Morgan Chase is about $2.3 trillion. Shareholder equity, $180 billion, depending on how you want to count it. They claim to be a well-capitalized bank. If you measure J.P. Morgan Chase's under IFRS, the European accounting standards, which allows for a less generous netting of derivatives, I would argue strongly a more appropriate treatment of what happens to derivatives and what is the counterparty risk in the event of a crisis and a meltdown. JP Chase's current balance sheet is closer to $4 trillion. Same Bank of America. We have enormous banks, very highly leveraged if you measure it properly. Do not trust the bankers to measure this for you. They have interest in understating those measures of leverage. This is a huge fiscal risk. They care about it. It's a first-order fiscal risk. And responsible, sensible, pragmatic policy approach at this moment is to increase the capital, quote-unquote, hold more capital. Banks don't hold capital. Capital is not an asset. It's on the liability side of the balance sheet. It's equity. It's another word for shareholder equity. This should increase through suspending dividends across the board on an emergency basis, which the Federal Reserve absolutely can order. In addition, suspending those share buyback programs that are still in existence. Mr. Jamie Dimon said in his quarterly earnings call recently that they plan to reinstate their share buyback program at the end of this year. That should not be allowed. They should be up their equity as much as possible, proceed to avoid the kind of moments that Senator Conrad talked about at the beginning of this speech, September, October, and to reduce the risk, not eliminate, but reduce the risk of another big hit to U.S. fiscal accounts, which will only compound and worsen and bring forward all of the deeper underlying problems that we've talked about. So, thank you very much.
So I'm going to open up questions in just a minute, but we have a special guest here, a European voice, Stephanie Riso, who is with the European Commission, heads up a staff at the European Commission in Brussels on fiscal policy. And you've been listening to everything that we've been saying. We just love to about ourselves and then ask what you think of us. But I would just like to ask you one question here, which is, based on everything you know of what's been happening in Europe, do you want to come on up here? My question to you is, based on everything we've been living through and watching in Europe, what do you think governments for the U.S. ought to be, both in terms of our fiscal policy and in terms, perhaps, of how we brace for shocks? But had a great experiment with austerity in a number of countries. It hasn't gone that well. I'm not going to draw the inference. What do you think? What are you taking from all this?
Well, first, thank you very much for inviting me. I think it's been extremely enlightening for me to listen to all of you and the way you look at the European crisis and how you see the European crisis impacting the U.S. First, I just want to disagree strongly with one baseline. Greece is not going to leave the euro, and the euro is going to stay together. Why? If you remember why the U.S. went into the Second World War, we Europeans remember why we started this project. And the effect is way beyond a financial crisis, way beyond economic crisis. This effect was made so that in the European continent there will be peace. And it takes what it takes. There is undeniable that we are facing the most difficult crisis that Europe has been facing. One deny all the difficulties that you have all stressed. It is a multiple crisis, as has been said, but there has been a answer. The answer has not been as straightforward, as quick, as big as we could have lived. But who can say that we have not lived up to the challenge, and who can say that we have not proposed solutions? Just to show a more overhaul of the economic and fiscal governance in Europe. Tomorrow, our countries, our member states as we call them, will have to go through the European institution validation of their budget before they can adopt it. This is major for sovereign states. We've been setting up crisis resolution mechanisms that did not exist before. We're demonstrating the willingness of ensuring financial solidarity between the strongest and the weakest of our member states. We are in the process of creating a banking union and try to solve the difficulties we're facing in the banking and financial sector. We are directing the community resources, budgetary resources, to fund jobs. We are changing the way our nations, but also our citizens, are looking to Europe. For the first time ever, we have put black on white the fact that the Union was going for a political union. Banking, fiscal, economic, and political union. That is the long plan that for credibility, as was said before, for Europe, and what is the need, that is what is required to create this stability. We are not out. It's hectic, it's going to be difficult, it's going to take time, more time. But there is no doubt that this budget is going to fail. Now, for the U.S., just on my field, rules, fiscal surveillance, there's one thing I've been through several meetings over the past days with all the institutions dealing with budget in the U.S., and I've been struck by two things. And I agree with you, Professor, on one thing, is the way the government is not taking into account huge liabilities beyond the banking sector that you have highlighted very well. Everybody talks to me about the federal debt, but that's not the only one. You have local and you have state debt, and you add them up, the situation is different, and extremely different. And that is something that struck me. And the second thing is that we have learned the lesson that if you have rules that you can change, every government do fiscal policy, we come to the point where the rules stop by, and we'll be saying, okay, not now, later on. And the lesson we have learned in Europe is that in order to ensure long-term fiscal sustainability, you need to have fiscal rules, and you need to have them imposed. You need to have them enforced. You cannot change them when you start facing the very difficult thing. And we've done it at the European level, imposing rules on our member states. You might want to reflect on how you could design some fiscal rules that would not be discussed by every administration coming in.
Great. So, I'd just like to throw out I sense a bit of attention here along the lines of austerity question. I'd just like to throw it out if people have a quick thought here on whether, how much we should be worried about budget tightening at this time, and if there is a better or worse way to give the economy a lift through the government, through taxes versus spending or what have you. So just a quick thought, because I think that politically this is the big question that people are going to be battling, fiscal discipline now versus return. How much room do we have to move? Simon?
Yes.
Yes. Talk about
So I would suggest that at the end of this year, the Congress and the President not stand for the Bush era tax cuts. And having done that, propose, if President Obama is reelected, this is practical possibility. Obviously, it's not if it's Romney's left, but it proposed a temporary payroll tax cut to take effect as soon as Congress, early 2013. That would last for, you would have it for initially 1 year or 2 years. The idea being that that's a tax cut for a lot of middle-class Americans. It's trying to offset on a temporary basis what you think non-extension of the Bush era tax cuts will do. Senator Conrad said, if you only, well, I think it's the slide, if you only after the high-end part of the Bush era tax cuts, it's not enough to make a significant difference to the medium deficit. It's about 1/4 of the deficit adjustment you can get from all the tax cuts. This is a middle-class country still. The middle class pays the taxes. That needs to be, in our view, a part of the shift that takes place to strengthen the revenue base that Senator Conrad talked about. But the economy, with all of that at once, not such a great idea. Also, persuading Republicans to vote for anything they regard as a tax increase, probably not very likely. However, the extension of the tax cuts just requires a veto of the President, and then asking Republicans to vote for a tax cut on a temporary basis. Well, I think that's much more likely to work.
Any other quick thoughts on austerity? From Europe here?
I suspect we all agree that at this particular moment for the United States, austerity is not the best idea. Having said that, of course, we then find ourselves in a political box. As Simon just suggested, you can come to very different conclusions about what is likely or not likely depending upon what happens in our election in November. No matter what happens in November, a solution to this problem will require either 5 or 6 impossible things to happen. I can't name what 5 or 6 they are, and I can't give you a very good argument for one number or the other, but it's going to, any suggestion of what we ought to do is going to cross lines that would appear to be uncrossable in terms of our politics. So, given that's the case, we can bandy back and forth arguments about which impossible thing would be the best to do. I think Simon's suggestion is very useful if it can happen. I think my alternative impossible solution would be a temporary income tax as opposed to a payroll tax cut. The reason being that the payroll tax holiday that we've had for the last couple of years has raised questions about its impact or non-impact on the viability of our Social Security system. And I think those arguments are just decisions as we try to move forward in solving our Social Security problem as well as our other problems. We could do a temporary income tax cut that would actually be more generous to low-income households and therefore probably generate more short-term consumption than would a further temporary suspension of payroll tax cuts. But we're talking niceties here, and I don't want to exaggerate the difference between that and what Simon has suggested. But the bottom line is we do need short-term stimulus. I very much appreciated what Senator Conrad had to say. The one area where I think I would differ from him is in the suggestion that infrastructure investment in the United States can be done quickly. I think the experience is that it in fact isn't. Responding to one disaster, I think, is a lot easier to accelerate than increasing, for example, construction of highways and other infrastructure projects, which incidentally are not produced by generic unemployed construction workers, most of whom in the United States come from the residential construction industry. We do not have reservoirs of people who are prepared to lay down asphalt roads. We have reservoirs of people who put up drywall and string electrical wiring, and those are not the same skills.
First of all, keeping track of time here, we're at 10:05. I'm going to go just a couple more minutes to allow a couple of questions from the audience, if there are any. Yes, sir. And do identify yourself.
Mark Jaffe, former analyst at Moody's. I went to business school a long time ago, and I was taught the efficient markets hypothesis, which is basically the idea that market prices reflect all the available information efficiently. And we've seen time and again that that's not true. For example, house prices going out of control, what we saw in the dot-com bubble, and so forth. We have a set of interest rates that different sovereigns are facing. And because of the ubiquity of the efficient markets hypothesis in our thinking, we somehow think that these prices or interest rates actually embed all of the information, but they don't. They embed misinformation coming from rating agencies, and general ignorance on the part of investors. In this room, there's a lot of knowledge about the fiscal situation of this country and other countries, and what I think we really need is for the community to communicate to markets in a way that markets understand. That there is actually a lot of risk in, say, 30-year U.S. Treasury bonds, and maybe there's not much risk in certain European bonds that are out there right now. So, I mean, the question is directed more to Doug, since you, like me, come out of the financial markets. What do you think about that?
I'll jump in. Please do. Yeah.
It's a great question.
So let me accept your premise. I absolutely believe from my own 2 days in the field that investors are only somewhat rational, and we of all kinds, people on Wall Street, ordinary investors, get carried away, get caught up in some idea, go too far in one direction, too far in the other. Certainly not about to suggest that current market prices reflect all the information that's out there accurately. But that said, I think in the Euro crisis and with our own fiscal crisis, the markets are acting fairly rational. They look at this and say, this is a political problem. With the possible exception of Greece, all of the European countries, if they have the political will, can still pay. If they don't have the political will, it doesn't really matter what their economic base is. Silly. This great Churchill quote, I'm sure you've heard many times, but to the fact that the U.S. always does the right thing after trying everything else, I do think that's what the market believes, as I do. So I think we look at the U.S. and say, politically, it's a horror to watch, but in the end, we'll do what we have to do, so it's safe to own these bonds. In Europe, because they're structured such that you've got 17 different countries in the European Euro area who don't all agree on what it's about and what should be done, there is more political risk.
Ed, can I just add to that, please? Yeah, I don't know from who's rational in this, but if you have a big fiscal crisis or perceived fiscal crisis at the end of this year, early next year, if you fall off a fiscal cliff, you have a big fight over the debt ceiling. My expectation would be that yields on U.S. government debt would fall because we are the safe haven, and if you make the world look more scary, for example, through our own political deadlock, that actually will bring more investors into long-term government securities, which will strike you as odd, and I agree with that. And though the danger will be to Europeans, because more pressure. Now, I hope Stephanie's right. I don't believe she is, but I wish her well. And I really, no, seriously. But the last thing that she and her colleagues need is a beating from the markets because everybody's decided that, oh, we just can't touch peripheral European risk, therefore Italian, Spanish, whatever French, whatever you think is peripheral, January, February 2013, those yields go up dramatically. Now, the view that will actually help the Europeans fix their problems, I don't subscribe to that view. I think that's too much pressure too soon. Things could actually break. And we damage the world, and damage the world economy, and therefore damage ourselves, particularly we have a debilitating, awful shouting match. If we generate political risk, or the position of deadlock in our own system, and the most likely way in which that will play out, the most clear mechanism or specific problem is people digging in around revenue and saying revenue. You can't make these numbers work. You really seriously cannot. Okay? Everything people tell you that making it work without revenue is just a solution. If you eliminate Medicare, which is why you're just increasing healthcare costs. Okay? The key for our competitiveness, for the economy, for growth, is not the government pay part of medical costs. Medical costs as a percent of GDP. Right? You can read PO on this. But so both sides have to get, I think, clearer and have a responsible conversation. Otherwise, we will damage the world.
I'm Joshua Green, independent consultant. A lot of organizations like the Concord Coalition, like the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, have been working for a number of years now to try to explain the fiscal problem, what has to be done, offer what you might call reasonable answers, even showing options for this. And yet, we continue to find large proportions of the public, in effect, either not listening or not believing this. Based on the experience that you have, what kind of an education really is needed in order to change public opinion on this? And here I'll toss in a related point. There are a few countries, clearly much smaller, arguably very different. I think of Singapore as an example, that seem to have been more successful at getting across notions to their public about the need for a certain amount of care in budgeting. So based on your experience, what more needs to be done to try to change public opinion?
Well, yeah, I think the fundamental problem for U.S. and the public perception has been that one of the problems has been that our interest rates have been so low. It used to be in the late 90s when we were, during the Clinton administration, when we were pushing for this need for economic health by reducing the budget deficit, the argument was always, well, you know, if we run up big budget deficits, borrowing for all Americans will go up. And the issue of why does the deficit matter to an ordinary American has been less resonant this time around because interest rates have been like at record lows, even though we're saying the deficit is a problem. That understanding that the deficit is a problem requires a more long-term perspective, And unfortunately, I found that Americans are much more nearsighted than many people, globally. And I think that because we haven't been a culture that saves very well for ourselves privately, it's hard to understand this notion of why, as a country, we should be saving through the public sector as well as the private sector, and especially hard to find that discipline when you've been conditioned to believe that borrowing is cheap or even free, and your own politicians act as if deficit financing is the best way to finance any new spending or any new tax cut, because it seems as if the economic cost is free. Obviously they think the political cost is negative, that it's a bonus to them. But economically, nobody really understands the longer-term cost of owning up such large debt. And the fact is, we can't just point to everyday interest rates. We can't say, look, your student loan interest rates are going to go up, or your mortgage interest payments are going to go up. We haven't been able to point to interest rates as immediate evidence of the economic cost of budget deficit. So that's been a challenge.
I'm going to cut right here, just because we have an online audience. I don't want to go definitely. However, informally, we can continue this discussion for a little bit longer. Let me just throw in a couple of concluding remarks. One is that it seems I would issue a plea that when we look to the problems in Europe and think about what they mean here, that we care to break away from the reflexive stereotypes that we have. That the lesson from Europe is strictly about overspending by government or overborrowing, and whatever people think about the lessons of austerity, and recognize that these really are very hard political problems. I disagree with you totally, with Diane, in terms of people understanding the long view. I think people do understand the long view, but short-term pressures are so intense on everybody. As Senator Conrad said, Congress is in a very real way reflecting the political view out there of their constituents, and nobody wants to make those short-term painful sessions now, but do need to. It's very tough. In any case, let's conclude the formal part of this, and we can still be available to talk and address questions. I know there are a lot of questions out there. So, and thanks to our incredible panel.
That was